Good morning. How are you, Chris?
Sarah.
I haven't seen you in like 18 months.
So here we are. We're back working on climate in person again, sort of prepping for a legislative session that doesn't start till January, but we've got a lot of things ahead of us. But we wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the story of Global Warming Solutions Act, because it really was quite a roller coaster. And the last time that Chris and I were together in person recording one of these was the day that everything shut down for the pandemic.
Right.
And at that moment, we had been making progress on moving global warming solutions through the legislative process. And at that moment, we really didn't know. We didn't know whether all of our priorities and all the good work that we'd done was going to be set aside to make way for COVID recovery. Turns out that, the legislature can walk and chew gum at the same time. We did some really great work getting that coronavirus relief fund money out into the communities, making sure that people were supported, bolstering the resilience of our towns and villages to support their people.
Right.
How many school buses running around dropping off lunches did you see? I still see coolers at the end of people's driveways.
Yeah.
You maybe don't see that in Burlington, but
We have drops in central locations. But
yeah, our roadsides are still dotted with coolers where the school bus would drop off lunch for the kids.
we were hearing teachers were sometimes helping.
Yes,
and,
It was
really
the only
great,
contact that they had with their students.
a really great. Actually, there's a lot of parallels to the climate because communities came together in the pandemic and in a very local way, which I think has got some promise for us.
Yeah.
So late in the pandemic legislative session, we did pass Global Warming Solutions Act. And part of the logic, I think, we were very focused on COVID, but we knew that in the immediate years, like now, this was a year ago, like right now and next year and the year after that, the federal government was very likely to respond with infrastructure money, with some kind of stimulus money. And we wanted to be ready to make sure that some of those investments helped us in our battle with climate.
Right.
So we managed to get it passed. But even before that, we one of the things that made a big difference to legislators was the public engagement.
Yeah.
And the public sort of getting focused on one bill, for instance. That's a big difference because when you campaign, you hear some people are very interested in climate. What are you doing for climate? But it's not like they're saying, what are you doing about climate and where is Bill H, blah, 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 right? It's a very broad topic. It's hard to know what to prioritize. And the public forums that you and I and other legislators held all over the state were very telling because we were talking about some priorities that we were going to push, including Global Warming Solutions Act. And I remember a couple things. People were really appreciative of the discussion. People said, why can't we do this more?
I wish we could do more of this. It's hard to stay as engaged as I want to. And I would love it if we could look into creating webinars so that all of us around the state could have this continued regular dialogue and engage more and more people who couldn't come.
And young people came and what did they say?
You're not being bold enough.
Yeah.
This is not enough. Do more, do it faster, do it better. Because I just remember one teenager, I think she said it to you, that she wasn't sure she was ever going to have a family because she wasn't sure she wanted to bring kids into
and
this
they
world.
weren't wrong, right? They're looking at the science.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing for both of us, I think, to have to say, look, the legislature's not perfect.
Yeah.
We are pushing as far as we can. So that just sits with me a lot.
Yeah.
Now, fast forward, Global Warming Solutions Act passes in an intense time in Montpelier and gets vetoed.
Yeah.
So now we've got to try to override the veto, and that's a much higher bar, 100 votes in the House, 20 votes in the Senate.
Yeah.
And we did it. You did it. really. People poured on pressure onto elected officials, and it worked. And we narrowly did it, right? What was the vote in the House? 100 exactly?
100 or 101 maybe.
100. There might have been a couple Republicans, right? I remember, I can't remember which vote, but I remember somebody saying, this isn't perfect, but I refuse to do nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What a great,
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Can we do more of that?
Right.
So we passed it in spite of the override. In spite of the veto. And we set up targets, emission reduction targets. We got to bring in the law. So we put targets. Here's the emission we got to reductions we got to do. And by the way, Vermont's been trailing our neighbors in New England in terms of how much we're reducing emissions. We exceed our neighbors in New England in terms of per capita emissions. So we really have our work to do. So the bill, just a quick snapshot of the bill. It has emission reduction targets, 26% reduction of 2005 emissions, got to drop by about a quarter by 2025. It's right around the corner. And then 40% reduction from the 1990 emissions by 2030, and an 80% reduction from 1990 by 2050. Now, this tracks the Paris Agreement, right? That Governor Scott and others said, we're going to do, even though Trump withdrew us temporarily. Now we're back in that worldwide agreement.
Yeah. And, I think the logic of following the Paris goals was that, the recognition that we had all of these governors coming together and joining this U.S. Climate Alliance and affirming our Paris commitments. And it only makes sense for all of us to be driving towards the same thing, because honestly, as we develop strategies and solutions here in Vermont, other states are going to be looking to that.
Right.
And in fact, as Chris said, we're behind our neighbors. So why don't you talk a little bit about what's happening with our neighbors who maybe are already a little ways ahead of us?
So we weren't alone to enact the Global Warming Solutions Act or something like it. Maine and New York had done something very similar the year before us, just before COVID. Massachusetts had done it a decade ago. And as I understand it, Connecticut at least is looking at something similar now. But one of the interesting dynamics, and it's why Sarah and I are going to be talking to you a lot in the coming weeks. In Maine and New York, the governor didn't veto, the governor was part of it. And a booster. And so the public discussion in those states about their respective climate plans has been way different than what we've had. Yeah. And that it worries me in Vermont, because a plan of how do you reduce emissions by 26% from 2005 levels in 4 years is not just one or two things. It could be, this is what the legislature demands is tell us what we should do.
Yeah.
And then carrying that out and having the political will to execute that is going to take everybody.
Yeah.
And, in Maine and New York, they're in a similar trajectory, but they've had sort of, I think, a more engaged public dialogue about it in the years that it's taken them to pull the plan together.
Yeah.
So it's a little worrying, but here we are.
It's a little worrying, and I think that as we look at the science that tells us we don't have time to dilly-dally or waste on thinking about what we're going to do, we really need to see the kind of leadership that we saw during COVID, which was, here's the science, here's what the experts are telling us, here's how we are going to show that we care about our neighbors by doing X, Y, and Z. And that was the tone and the leadership that we saw during COVID. And that's the tone and the leadership that we need in order to solve the climate crisis and in order to bring Vermonters along. Look, nobody in Vermont wanted to stay home every day, all day. Nobody would have chosen voluntarily to move their kids to remote learning online. And yet we did these things, and look at how much better off we are than other places around the country and around the world, because we came together and we said, okay, governor says follow the science. And so as we move into the next steps of the implementation of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the release of the climate plan, we really need to have that kind of message out to Vermonters. And we're hoping you all are going to help us to say, look, this is what the experts are telling us. This is what we need to do. Yes, it's different. Yes, it's in some cases uncomfortable.
Well, it's change. I mean, we can't keep doing the same thing and reduce our emissions.
Mm-hmm.
So it requires change. So change is always some upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
But we ought to be able to do it in a way that actually improves quality of life, strengthens our economy. In fact, many of the solutions involve staying more locally focused.
Mm-hmm.
So not importing fossil fuels from the Gulf Coast or wherever, but depending on solar energy right here in the state.
And with a few strategic investments that we certainly hope the climate plan will demand that Vermont make and help make on behalf of our citizens, we can actually reduce families' expenses on how they get around, on how they heat their homes, and improve the comfort of their homes. I mean, an electric vehicle, for instance, it costs a fraction to operate because you don't have oil changes. You don't have belts. You don't have all of that. Heat. You don't have an exhaust system. I have talked to friends who now have been driving electric vehicles for a number of years, and they say, look, other than putting the snow tires on in the winter and getting the brakes fixed once in a while, that's all I've done to my car.
Right.
Imagine that.
But most Vermonters by far cannot afford an EV, and so
that's where those strategic supports in order to help move in that direction.
The exciting thing, another exciting dynamic right now, is there's a lot of federal money coming in to deal with things like air quality, right? Things that relate to COVID, and even some of we're trying to figure out how you can use this money. But for instance, schools got a lot of money, so do towns directly from the feds. So hopefully schools will say, you know what, we can use this one-time money, invest in solar array for our roof, and radically reduce our energy costs in our operating budget, and so bring tax rates down, right? Or slowing the growth of school budgets. So
here's another one. I got another one, just because we're throwing out cool ideas of ways that the infrastructure dollars that are coming into the state can be used as a win-win. Municipal wastewater systems, right?
Yeah.
Big emitters of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and one that we don't want to be just blowing off into the atmosphere. And so as we do improvements in our wastewater treatment facilities with our ARPA dollars and with our infrastructure dollars, we can be helping municipalities run their systems more efficiently and reducing the emissions out of their wastewater.
And what
systems.
Do they make? They cap it somehow, make power out of the methane?
Why not?
Right? I think so. And so now they're pushing electricity onto the grid. And we just saw that in Addison County, a methane digester, biggest one in New England, going to be, reduce methane emission, reduce phosphorus emission, an economic benefit to that particular farm. If we're thoughtful about it, and we are trying to be thoughtful, it should be a change, but not a painful change. It should be positive, but it's a change. So people are going to have to, we're going to have to work together, and we're going to have to decide we're pulling in this direction together, because otherwise, it is going to splinter, and it's going to be tricky politically and economically and so on. So back to the Global Warming Solutions Act. So with all these sort of ideas in mind, and the legislature not of one mind of how to do it, we were of one mind that we wanted to address this. And so we put the targets in there. There's an accountability provision, and we set up a council, climate council. It's called 23 members.
Yeah.
Why is it so darn big?
Well, because it's a big problem, and it's a big challenge, and we wanted to make sure that the challenge was shared between government generally and members of the public. And so the council is really made up of a core of 8 cabinet members from different departments of the state.
Transportation, ag, energy, the predictable ones, right?
Commerce, and those folks really being able to represent how government can be harnessed to help do this work on behalf of Vermonters. There's 8 members of the council that were appointed by the House of Representatives, and those folks are, representing the fuel sector, representing rural communities,
manufacturers,
representing manufacturing.
Who else here? The utilities. Actually, Greenmount Power has a member there.
Yep, an expert in climate change science. So the Vermont State climatologist is on there. And so, these are folks. In fact, we're going to talk with one of them in the coming days, who's representing someone who has expertise in the design of greenhouse gas reduction programs.
And the Senate gets 8 to 7 members. The Senate leaders appoint. One is a youth representative. There's somebody from the farm and forest sector. Data analyst. So you get the sense somebody, an expert in resilience and disaster response. Mm-hmm. So it was cumbersome because it's not a single sector, right? It's got to really represent the broad and lay of the land and is geographically representative. Yeah. And they've been working hard. Yeah. They've been working hard for coming up on a year now, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And their charge is by December 1 to present the legislature and the administration with a plan. Here's the targets. Here's the plan that would get you there. That's a quick timeline.
It is. But they've organized themselves. Well, the law directed them to organize themselves into subcommittees. So each of these 23 is going to sit on a subcommittee, and there's 5 subcommittees, and they're focused on what we know are the major things that we need to focus on. There's a Just Transition subcommittee who's really focused on making sure that the most impacted are at the table and being centered in how we design our solutions. There's the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, which is the one that I sort of consider to be like, this is where it's at. This is where the rubber meets the road. Yeah. These are folks who are coming together to figure out, what are the strategies and the pathways that we are going to use to actually reduce our emissions.
So it's not just sort of just transportation, but it's cross-sector. Okay, agriculture is 15% of our emissions, but we're not going to ignore that. We're going to have some projections there, or some solutions there.
And what are the unique solutions that we need to be thinking about for agriculture, for industry, for waste and wastewater?
Then there's the resilience and adaptation subcommittee.
Yeah,
those folks are really interesting because actually I'm guessing that a lot of everyone says, well, what's the cost? Well, obviously we're going to have to deeply understand that. But what's the cost of inaction? We're seeing floods. We're seeing 7 inches more rain every year in Vermont. Ask farmers if they believe climate change is having an impact. There's not a debate actually among the ag community that I've talked to, because they're dealing with a lot of rain in a way that they didn't used to. Yeah. And what's the cost of ignoring that? Mm-hmm. It's pricey to replace those culverts, to replace your bridges, your walkways, all that, when you're seeing floods pretty reliably.
Yeah, Southern Vermont just last night. just getting whacked over and over again.
The utilities, right? The utilities used to think of their whole strategy was about that one big event every winter. Now it's about these micro storms that blow through a tiny little area and pull all these trees down and interrupt the grid that way. Then there's ag and ecosystems, another subcommittee that we've said 4 of them, I think. Straightforward in terms of trying to think about the unique needs of Vermont ag and our working lands, our forest land.
And how can we use those potentially in the future? Because we recognize that changes in farming practices can actually help sequester more carbon.
Absolutely.
Changing in forestry practices can augment the way our forests sequester carbon. So that's an important part of the conversation, and one that I think Vermont is very well positioned to capitalize on behalf of the rest of the country who may not have what we have in the way of agriculture and forest land.
Right. States like us in Maine with big tracts of forest land clearly have a unique maybe ability to help the region more handle the charge of sequestering carbon. And then we have science and data, right? It's all got to be backed up by data. We can't guess that, well, maybe if you try that. No, it's like, if you try this, we would anticipate this outcome.
Because honestly, don't you want to know, like, if you've got $10 to spend, what's the best way to spend that money? And the science and data subcommittee is really working on cranking through the numbers. These are the most effective programs to reduce emissions. These are the most effective sectors. And then they'll bring those all together and cross-check each other's work and come up with a plan that gives us the set of goals that we need to get to 2025.
And some of the folks on the Climate Council are worldwide experts. I mean, actually, it's been very fun to watch the homegrown expertise that we've had across the state engage in this challenge and kind of say, I would do this. I've been to China, I've helped them with their grid, I've worked in Europe, just kind of a broad perspective of what we're trying to do here. So I'm cautiously optimistic here, and we have big piles for us relative of federal money that we can potentially use to get this process really started. So it's exciting, but the political lift is very real.
Yeah.
And if you've been in the legislature or watched Montpelier at all, there tends to be a sort of whoa,
we thought
down here.
That was great in concept, but whoa.
Yeah. Well, when I said we wanted to address climate, I didn't realize, it was going to be $100 million price tag. Well, it might be, and what's the cost of inaction? And how much of the federal money, we got $1 billion from the feds last year, can we put there? I think a lot. And I think that, ultimately, if we do it well, we make investments that strengthen our economy, that don't hurt Vermonters anything but, make it cheaper to live here and have a higher quality of life. Is that the overview? Is that what we want folks to know? What else do we need to let them clue them in on? So I do want people to be focused on the timeline here. Because we're recording this in the summer, and this fall, September, October, the Climate Council is charged with getting around the state and talking to Vermonters about it. You gotta stay engaged, please. Go to those events. We're
gonna publicize those events as soon as we hear the dates and the places. I would imagine some of them will be in person, some of them will have a virtual component. We need Vermonters to show up at those events the way you came to our events and said, are you being bold enough? Are you sure you can't do more? Or this is unacceptable because it's moving too slowly. But we need Vermonters to get out there and make their voices heard and kick the tires on this the way you helped us in 2019 kick off Global Warming Solutions Act. And so these events are going to be places where the members of the Climate Council will be present, but there are also going to be things that that legislators and the governor are going to be listening to and watching for. So we hope that our climate supporters here will get out and get involved in these.
We need your help for sure. Sarah, nice to see you again.
It's good to see you. And you know who else it's good to see?
Bob, the green guy.
Bob. Hey, Bob.
Always helping us. Thanks, Bob.